This week on Act Out, as Medicare for All legislation heads towards congressional hearings, here's a look at why even well-meaning projects and reforms inside of our for-profit system are doomed from the outset. Next up, this country's got land for sale, as long as you're willing to destroy it for a measly profit margin and a step towards our painful collective suicide. And finally, Extinction Rebellion comes to the states. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A noise flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. So last week, House representatives announced that they would be holding hearings for Medicare for All legislation. This welcome news comes after decades of pushing for the painfully obvious and maligned solution to our absolutely fakaked healthcare system. The idea, everybody in, nobody out, healthcare for all. Of course, these hearings are just a very small stepping stone, and public pressure has to remain high and indeed grow in order to assert our demands for universal healthcare for all. A recent poll shows that 84% of Democrats believe providing health insurance coverage for everyone through a taxpayer-funded national plan like Medicare for All should be an extremely important priority. And, that's really no surprise, because some aspects of our grotesquely top-heavy system can be shielded from some Americans some of the time. But sooner or later, you or someone you know will clash harshly with our so-called healthcare system. More than 20 million Americans live without health insurance, and for those who do have health insurance, it's about as effective at shielding them from financial ruin as betting your house in a shady card game. There are countless stories in this as-yet unfinished tome of healthcare horrors, but for today, let's take, for example, Nina Dang, a 24-year-old living in San Francisco who has private health insurance. And one day last year, she got into a really bad bicycle accident. She ended up at Zuckerberg, yes, named for that Zuckerberg Public Hospital, the city's only top-tier trauma center. After her treatment, which included surgery and an ER stay, she was slapped with a more than $20,000 bill. Her insurance wouldn't pay for the balance because Zuckerberg Hospital doesn't accept private insurance. Any private insurance. Hospital spokesperson Brent Andrew explained the price gouging as a necessary evil associated with their high level of philanthropy. Our mission is to serve people who are underserved because of their financial needs. We feel like we have to recoup what we're able to from people who are insured because we're supporting people who don't have insurance. So, giving them the benefit of the doubt, which I'll admit is hard to do when the hospital is named after the only person that I've ever been even remotely close to thinking is actually a lizard person, let's just say that being out of network for everyone with private insurance is the only way to recoup the cost of serving those with no insurance. Well, first of all, that's just hugely unsustainable due to the fact that most people who have private insurance are also poor because, spoiler alert, most Americans are poor. Millions of low-income people make just enough to not qualify for Medicaid, meaning that they technically have insurance but no real way to pay for ever having to use it. Indeed, the majority of folks who go bankrupt due to medical bills have health insurance. Secondly, even if you were only price gouging folks who make enough to feel somewhat comfortable above the poverty line, how comfortable will they then be after getting slapped with tens of thousands in hospital bills? And mind you, this was for one accident, not ongoing care. One can only imagine what would have happened had she required multiple surgeries or several more days in the hospital. And as the city's only top-tier trauma center, your choices in San Francisco in the event of severe trauma, where, by the way, you're probably not able to be coherent enough to direct someone to an in-network hospital, your choices are then to either be so poor as to have no insurance, or rich enough to pay the exorbitant fees. Folks anywhere in that gaping midsection are, in other words, totally screwed. And while Zuckerberg Hospital is on the extreme end of not taking any private insurance, they're not alone in the practice of robbing Peter to pay Paul. Hospitals across the United States, in particular rural hospitals, are closing at astonishing rates because there aren't enough patients with good insurance to keep a hospital from losing money. And for instance, in states like Georgia, where nearly 40% of the population lives in poverty, patients with good insurance are quite hard to come by. And there are only so many of Zuckerberg's $75 million gifts to go around. So the solution? Close the hospitals. Hundreds of predominantly rural hospitals are closing in areas of the country that have the highest rates of heart disease, diabetes, and poverty. So what about the folks who need care? Well, too bad. As Alan Morgan, CEO of the National Rural Health Association, put it, those most in need of health services have the fewest options available, and we are closing rural hospitals. From a policy standpoint, we're going in the wrong direction. Yeah, no kidding. And yet, ironically, a popular and very inaccurate argument against universal health care in this country is that people don't want to have to pay for other people's care. But that's what happens in this system, not in Medicare for All. Here you have financially unstable people literally being threatened with collections agencies if they don't pay for care that they received at a cost based on other people's care. So that's like walking through a lower middle class neighborhood and demanding that the people who live there pay for repairs in the poorer neighborhood that's down the street. It's the classic and tired trope of pitting poor folks against one another instead of addressing those who make us poor. So meanwhile, the fat cat in the room that no one's addressing is, what about the rich assholes who aren't paying their share? Not even their share, they're stealing from us. And I don't just mean folks like Zuckerberg, but I mean the insurance agencies who make off like kings. They pay a couple of thousand out of a $20,000+ bill, pocket those monthly payments, and ignore the calls of desperate folks wondering how much a kidney is worth because rent is due. Conversely, Medicare for All is based on the idea that everyone gets free medical care when and how they need it because we all pay into the system at rates that reflect our incomes. And this is not to say that our tax system doesn't need an overhaul, because holy shit, does it ever. But Medicare for All wouldn't require you and I to pay more. Actually, we'd likely save money depending on what you currently pay for health insurance. Not to mention, the prices of meds would be severely reduced. Money for care would come not only on tax increases for the wealthy, like Zuckerberg, who need to pay their fair share, but also from the 1/3 of healthcare dollars today that we spend simply on totally superfluous administration. Those millions of dollars, billions of dollars, would be spent on actual care. What a concept. Therefore, universal healthcare is not only the only way to ensure that we all get the care that we need and deserve, but it's really the only way that we can keep hospitals open and have actual public hospitals, ones that serve the public as a whole without having to do so at the expense of any portion of that public. That is what Medicare for All means, and that is why no reform of our existing for-profit system can ever make that a reality. To learn more and join the fight for universal healthcare, visit healthoverprofit.org. We've talked on the show before about how neither oil nor gas are economically feasible anymore. Costs rise, profits drop, and meanwhile, renewables continue to make more and more economic, not to mention human survival, sense. Still, this has never really been a place of common sense in this country, particularly when it comes to what's best for people and planet. For instance, a look at this New Year's oil and gas land marketplace shows thousands and thousands of acres up for grabs, but only for oil and gas development. And while this is disgusting enough to consider with regards to private entities throwing land back and forth to be destroyed for the sake of a dying industry that kills, maims, and oppresses, our government is in on this too. Like, really in on this. As EnergyNet notes on their government sales page, EnergyNet is proud to have been selected as the vendor of choice to develop and host online lease sales for the U.S. Department of the Interior, Bureau of Land Management, as well as government agencies in the states of Texas, North Dakota, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and university lands. And that's no small deal considering that these lands are on the auction block only for fossil fuel projects. Indeed, caveats like this one in North Dakota that states that per North Dakota law, lands or coal in tracts that may be contained in lands sold with a reservation of coal deposits must be leased for coal mining purposes. Those are common across the country. There is no keep it in the ground option here. And so back in 2014, EnergyNet won the rights to be the online retailer for the Bureau of Land Management's oil and gas leasing operations. The move meant that previously public auctions could now take place in the shadowy and cozy confines of the internet, where interested parties can bid on the destruction of the planet in relative peace. Take a look at some of these most recent sales, and feel free to roughly add as you skim. That's thousands of acres that have been sold off just in the last month and a half, expressly for the purpose of oil and gas drilling. State governments offering up public land to enrich oil and gas tycoons, while grotesquely impoverishing land, air, water, and of course, people too. And one of the sellers that I found very interesting was the North Dakota Department of Trust Lands, an entity that manages educational trust funds through various investments, including oil and gas projects. Their numbers from last March, for instance, show that more than $100,000.
No, wait, scratch that. The number is actually over 100 million.
Came in from oil and gas. So that's good, right? I mean, how could $100K for education
actually 100 million
possibly be a bad thing? Well, because it's oil and gas. And we'll dig more into that one in just a second. But to be a capitalist for a moment, let me just say that it's not nearly what you could get if you invested in renewables. Already back in 2016, Bloomberg bluntly reported that wind and solar are crushing fossil fuels, stating that record clean energy investment outpaced gas and coal 2-to-1, meaning way more return on investment for whoever invests. In May of last year, Forbes reported that renewables far outstripped fossil fuels and nuclear in 2017, a full $333 billion worldwide compared to $144 billion invested in fossil fuels and coal. Experts suggest that the gap will only widen and expect that by the mid-2020s, the so-called clean trillion, an additional $1 trillion a year invested in clean energy, will be a reality. Forbes even lightly nudges readers at the end by offering up this flaccid comment. For forward-thinking investors, it seems as if fossil fuel weighting in investment portfolios is due another look. That's putting it mildly, but still, it's clear that even capitalism's biggest fans can't ignore the realities of a dying homicidal industry. I mean, even oil and gas are investing in renewables. They know the game is up, but they're so glad if we want to keep throwing money at their weathered wares. Put simply, our local, state, and federal governments are auctioning off land for the express purpose of wrecking it for less than you'd make by not wrecking it. And that's just surface costs. If you further consider the costs associated with attempts to bring the land back to neutral, something that's basically impossible, but that the Bureau of Land Management claims is very important, you're looking at a huge dent in any initial profits from that oil and gas. Still, investments are a big selling point for oil and gas industries. They can point at that $100K,
and again, that's 100 million,
and say, hey, we're paying for education. Outside of the aforementioned capitalist argument against this illogic, there's the fact that combining oil and gas destruction with education promotes a suicidal paradigm that we have less and less time to correct. As noted in an EcoWatch article on sustainable university investments from a few years ago, universities' investments matter because they are educating the future leaders and members of our society. Integrating energy efficiency and renewables into a school's culture exposes each wave of students to more efficient and more sustainable processes, systems, and behaviors. That's social change. That's legacy. That's scale. Schools are perhaps the most dangerous place to funnel oil and gas funds. The covert and overt pedestaling of an industry that's actively stealing children's futures makes for a sick, twisted curriculum. As dirty energy, direct action, and divestment movements continue to gain steam, we need to make sure that our focus includes these well-defended land auctions. These thousands upon thousands of acres, if not left to fully repair in wild form, should only be used in ways that sustain and protect life, not destroy it. Be that sustainable farming practices, renewable energy, or conservation land. And speaking of not being an all-out dick to the planet, you may recall from episode 187 our conversation with Extinction Rebellion in the UK. Well, as noted in that interview, this is an international and a growing movement. And here to talk to us about some stateside rebellion and upcoming events to plug into is Rory Verato with Extinction Rebellion, New York City. Take a look.
So the National Day of Action on January 26th, I can't divulge too much information right now for operational security reasons. So the best bet is for folks to follow our social media accounts at XR_NYC on Twitter and Instagram, and our website, xrr.nyc. We'll be updating periodically with information about the action on the 26th. I can give you some public information now. We're going to meet at the Grand Army Plaza in Manhattan, which is at 59th Street and 5th Avenue, southeast corner of Central Park, right next to the Plaza Hotel. That's the gathering place, at which point we will begin with a march, an unpermitted march. So this is like the entry-level, lowest risk action for folks to participate in. And we'll have experienced activists leading that march. And then we will go to an undisclosed location where we will escalate the action for those who wish to participate in arrestable acts.
Great. When we talked to Extinction Rebellion in England, the distinction was made between direct action and civil disobedience, and the latter being the focus of Extinction Rebellion. Would you say that it's the same for the Extinction Rebellion here or there in New York City?
I think that's a complicated and good question. So as I was preparing for this, like a good scholar, I looked up a definition of civil disobedience for us to work with from John Rawls. So I'll read that very quickly and we can discuss. Rawls writes that civil disobedience is a public, nonviolent, conscientious, yet political act contrary to law, usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government. So for me, as I understand civil disobedience, it would be a species of direct action. Direct action, I think, is any kind of action that's directed towards producing an immediate change, lacking that publicity component, especially. So let's say releasing animals from a laboratory, for example. That's a form of direct action, but not necessarily a form of civil disobedience because it may be secret, probably will be secret. Civil disobedience is meant to be performed publicly for that express purpose of producing political change. And I think, so far as I understand it, our emphasis will be on civil disobedience because political change is our aim. Radical political change is our aim. And also I would add that civil disobedience, I think importantly, is a form of communication. It's not just about breaking the law for moral reasons, but it's about communicating with those who may not be paying attention or who may not understand why the law is unjust, that in fact the law is unjust or the social order is unjust. And these folks who are willing to risk arrest in the act of civil disobedience are broadcasting that fact and revealing that fact, I think.
So there's more of a focus on the policy and rather, I guess the question is, do you see direct action potentially being a component for instance, Ende Gelände in Germany is something that has been a huge example of the power of direct action, for instance, specifically and directly shutting down coal mines in Germany. And, we see the same thing here with regards to pipelines, tree sits and blockades and disabling pipeline equipment. Do you see that as being either an important aspect of this fight or something that Extinction Rebellion would potentially take on themselves?
I think that's probably a part of Extinction Rebellion. I think the key is that to understand Extinction Rebellion, it's so decentralized and so emphasizing of autonomy that anybody can do almost anything in the name of Extinction Rebellion, so long as it accords with our 3 key demands and our 10 core principles, which are listed everywhere on the website, etc. And so direct action that is nonviolent, for example, which is one of our principles, can be undertaken in the name of XR. And so we're hoping for a diversity of tactics that will occur in a widespread way, in a diffuse way, that will bring attention to multiple issues in many ways.
It's something that we talk about on this show a lot is the importance of local action and how that aligns also with, for example, Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, the idea that you have to make goals that people can actually attain, otherwise people will burn out and leave the movement because it feels hopeless. How does Extinction Rebellion balance the power of local action with, of course, the problem that is global climate change and this global movement?
Yeah, I think that comes again back to the organizational structure, insofar as each sort of chapter of Extinction Rebellion is divided into a series of working groups. And so within each chapter, there will be clusters of folks who are fixated or focused on different elements, and they confer amongst each other in a coordinating committee, which then itself can communicate back down to the lower levels or up to the higher levels. And one of the principles of XR, as I understand it, is an emphasis to non-attachment of outcomes. So in other words, like we're trying to do our best with certain goals in mind that are going to be changing as we act, with the recognition that most or almost all of what we do will be relatively unsuccessful, perhaps in the grand scheme of things. So we're doing it anyway because there's meaningful significance to this kind of resistance. And there is a possibility that we can bring about the kind of change we're seeking to produce.
Yeah, that reminds me of Hedges' quote, "I do not fight fascists because I think I will win. I fight them because they are fascist."
Yes.
So in terms of the civil disobedience on the 26th and beyond, what do you expect the response to be? Is there any sort of, I know you said that it's an unpermitted march, but has there been any sort of coordination with NYPD or with law enforcement about these actions?
I don't know entirely, and part of the reason for that is that for operational security, again, things function on a need-to-know basis. I'm part of the media working group within the New York City chapter, not working as much in the action and logistics group, for example. And so I really only know the public details that I already gave to you. I suspect that there probably is not coordination with the NYPD, given that it is unpermitted, given that we are intending to engage in civil disobedience. However, I do know that we expect that we have been infiltrated and that we are being surveilled, and that just comes with the territory. So we're prepared for that and preparing for that. We have amazing people that have a lot more experience than I do in organizing and activist work, who are helping us to facilitate nonviolence direct action trainings, who are organizing these kinds of things to help mitigate the response from the state.
Yeah, and you make an excellent point. The idea with infiltration is it's not a matter of if, it's when, and folks just kind of need to accept that as a shitty reality of this work and work better on our responses to that as opposed to trying desperately to stop it from happening, because it will happen. In terms of numbers, if you have an idea and you feel comfortable telling me, do you have any idea of how many people are willing to engage in this civil disobedience to potentially risk arrest?
Yes, actually. So we held a mass meeting on Saturday at the Quaker Meeting House in Manhattan, and we had and we collected some of that data. That was part of what we were hoping to do with that mass meeting, in addition to sort of building spirit and things like that in community. And so some of the numbers that we collected and that I can give you, the attendance in general at the event was about 300 or so people, which is pretty good on short notice. We got commitments for participation in the action on the 26th that are in the range of 700 to 800 people, which for an act of civil disobedience is quite large. And we also collected data that showed that about 35 or 40 people are willing to host house meetings in New York City to sort of cultivate new working groups and smaller chapters of Extinction Rebellion here in the city.
So in terms of, wrapping up here, because I know that a lot of people are interested in this, and of course we already had folks from the UK on the show, and the momentum is really building on this. What are you asking of folks who want to be a part of this, and what, if anything, are you saying that needs to be risked or given up to really be serious and honest about what we're facing here?
Yeah, I think we're both asking a lot and asking nothing. And what I mean by that is that XR is essentially a coalition or an alliance of the willing. These are people who are already aware of the situation and understand what certain risks entail with getting involved with something like XR. And so, given our commitment to civil disobedience in particular, I guess you can say that we are asking or expecting amongst ourselves that some of us will jeopardize our freedom, right? Risk arrest, risk jail time, risk imprisonment, and that goes with the scaling levels of action and risk. So that's, I think, the biggest ask that we have. But again, people are coming to XR because many of them are already willing to engage in this way. And I mean, there's also the recognition that we have to change a whole lot within society, right, in terms of consumption levels and everything. And so this is just one step.
To learn more about Extinction Rebellion in New York City, see the link below and after the show. And for the full interview with Rory, please do check out our podcast available on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thanks for watching, and please do spread this as per usual, and check out that last slide and the show description to find sites mentioned in this week's show. And for interim updates, make sure that you sign up for our newsletter at the address below. It is the best way to stay up to date as censorship continues. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some roster through. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since your push to serve my shove. I'm not a fighter.